Richard Vance didn't look up from his polished mahogany desk when Elias Thorne walked into the First National Bank of Oak Haven. Richard was 28 years old, wore a suit that cost more than a good plow, and carried the kind of confident smile that isn't really a smile at all. He had a college ring on his finger and a promotion to Vice President of Agricultural Lending in his immediate future. Elias was 68 years old. He wore canvas work pants, a chambray shirt, and boots he resoled himself. His hands were the color and texture of the bark on a dry cottonwood. He had farmed the same 40 acres of Oak Haven bottomland since he returned from the Korean War, working dirt that his father had broken with a mule team in 1921. It was a Tuesday morning in October, and the wind outside carried the scent of dry corn stubble and diesel exhaust, a smell that meant harvest was over and the harsh reality of winter math was settling in. Elias wasn't there for a handout. He was there to ask for a simple 90-day extension on a $4,000 operating loan. It was a bridge loan he had taken out to cover a sudden hospital bill for his late wife, and the dry summer had left his corn yield just a few bushels shy of clearing the note. Richard Vance leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his clean, uncalloused fingers, and looked at Elias the way a man looks at something stuck to the bottom of his boot. "Elias, I'm looking at your file," Richard said, his voice dripping with practiced corporate sympathy. "You're farming 40 acres with a 1953 Farm All Super M. The combined age of your machinery is older than most of the people in this town. You don't have the scale, you don't have the leverage, and, frankly, you don't have the yield to justify this extension." Elias stood perfectly still. "The ground has been dry," Elias said, his voice quiet, lacking any defensive edge. "But the soil is good. The winter wheat is already drilled. I just need 90 days. Richard chuckled. It wasn't a quiet chuckle. It was a full, open, disbelieving laugh, the kind meant to humiliate. He stood up and walked around the desk, placing a condescending hand on Elias's shoulder. "Elias, I'm not going to give you 90 days, Elias. I'm going to give you some free advice. The bank's real estate division has developers looking for flat acreage right where your farm sets. They want to build a subdivision. You owe us $4,000. Your land is worth $40. We can foreclose, take our cut, and hand you the scraps. Or you can sign the deed over to our developers today." Richard patted the old man's shoulder. "Sell the 40 acres, old man. You're too old to be doing this the hard way. Take the money, move into an apartment in town, and let the people who understand modern business take over." Elias stepped back, letting the young banker's hand fall away. He looked at the polished desk, the pristine college ring, and the stack of foreclosure warnings sitting in Richard's outbox. "My father taught me a lot of things," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but mostly he taught me that the people who tell you what you can't do are usually the ones who are terrified you'll prove them wrong." Elias turned and walked out of the bank. He didn't argue, he didn't raise his voice. Behind him, as the heavy glass door swung shut, he heard Richard Vance tell his secretary, "Draft the foreclosure papers. That stubborn old relic is going to farm himself right into a grave." What Richard Vance didn't know, what nobody in that polished bank understood, was that they hadn't just insulted an old man. They had started a 15-year ticking clock. And when that clock finally struck zero, Elias Thorne wasn't just going to save his 40 acres. He was going to buy the building Richard Vance was standing in. Before we get to the moment Elias proved every suit in that bank wrong, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who thought a piece of paper on their wall made them smarter than a lifetime of dirt on your hands? Have you ever been told to give up on something you built with your own blood and sweat just because you didn't look the part? If you believe that real wisdom comes from patience, hard work, and the soil beneath our feet, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. Every single subscriber helps this channel tell the true, forgotten stories of the working class that the modern world tries to ignore. Drop a comment down below and tell me about a time someone told you that you were too old or too far behind to succeed. Let's prove them wrong together. Now, let's get back to 1993 and the quiet, brilliant revenge of Elias Thorne. Elias drove his 1962 Ford F-100 pickup truck back to his farm. He didn't panic. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't put a for sale sign in his yard. He simply walked into his equipment shed, pulled back a canvas tarp, and looked at his 1953 Farmall Super M. The loan was due in 10 days. Richard Vance was expecting Elias to default. But Richard Vance only understood ledgers. He didn't understand the network of men who worked with their hands. Elias walked into his house, lifted a loose floorboard in the kitchen, and pulled out a heavy metal coffee tin. Inside was exactly $4,150. It was cash he had saved over a decade of repairing hydraulic pumps and rebuilding diesel engines for his neighbors in the dead of winter, charging half of what the dealerships charged, and never reporting it as anything other than favors between friends. He drove back into town the very next morning, walked up to the bank teller, and paid the $4,000 note in full in wrinkled, grease-stained $20 bills. Richard Vance watched from his glass office, his face tight with annoyance. Elias didn't even look at him. He took his receipt, folded it into his chambray shirt pocket, and walked out. He had kept his 40 acres, but as he drove away, Elias made a silent vow. The bank had shown him its true face. They weren't there to help farmers. They were there to harvest them. Over the next 5 years, Richard Vance climbed the corporate ladder at First National. The late 1990s were a boom time in agriculture. Grain prices were climbing, and the government was telling farmers to plant fence row to fence row. Vance became the driving force behind an aggressive lending campaign. He drove a company truck from farm to farm, wearing his pressed shirts, carrying a briefcase full of financing terms. His message was always the same: expand now, borrow to grow, leverage is your friend. He pushed his neighbors to buy $150,000 tractors with computerized cabs. He convinced men who had farmed debt-free for decades to leverage their ancestral land to buy neighboring parcels at massively inflated prices. He sold debt disguised as progress, and for a while it looked like genius. Vance was promoted to bank president by the time he was 35. He was hailed as a visionary. But Elias Thorne was doing something entirely different. While the rest of the county was drowning in 12% interest loans, Elias quietly went backwards. He operated on a rule his father had beaten into his head during the Great Depression: never owe more than you can pay off in one bad year. Elias didn't expand his acreage. He didn't buy a new John Deere. Instead, he stopped buying from the system entirely. Elias recognized that the massive chemical bills his neighbors were paying, sometimes $40,000 a year for synthetic fertilizers and herbicides, were the very things keeping them chained to Richard Vance's bank. So Elias stopped spraying. He planted cover crops, crimson clover, hairy vetch, and cereal rye, letting them die back and decompose to feed the soil naturally. His neighbors mocked him at the local feed store. They said he was growing weeds on purpose, that the old man had finally lost his mind. But Elias wasn't listening to the feed store. He was listening to the dirt. He walked his 40 acres every week with a shovel and a composition notebook. He dug holes, counted earthworms, checked the root depth, and smelled the soil. He knew that soil isn't a thing you use up, it's a living thing you take care of. By year 3, while his neighbors were taking out emergency operating loans to afford nitrogen, Elias was spending $0 on inputs. His yields were slightly lower, but his net profit per acre was suddenly the highest in the entire county. Then, Elias took his quiet rebellion a step further. He started attending commercial seed auctions, standing in the back with his arms folded. He waited until the auctioneer brought out the culls, the reject seeds that the big corporate distributors threw away because their germination rates were too inconsistent for high-speed automated planters. The shiny corporate farm managers laughed at the culls, calling them trash, not worth the fuel to haul home. Elias bought them for pennies on the dollar. He took them back to his equipment shed, built a homemade germination chamber out of a modified cooler and a $40 heat mat, and tested every single bag by hand. He figured out exactly which batches were viable, adjusted his old Farmall's planting density to compensate for the lower germination rates, and planted.
By the year 2002, Elias's input costs were 90% lower than the county average. He was netting pure, untaxed, debt-free profit, and he saved every single dime. He didn't buy a new truck. He didn't buy a television. He funneled the cash into a quiet holding company he registered 2 counties over, named simply Cottonwood Holdings, LLC. Nobody knew he had money. To Richard Vance and the men at the bank, Elias Thorne was just an impoverished relic clinging to a dying way of life, driving a rusted truck past their gleaming glass windows. The brilliance of Elias's strategy didn't become visible until the system started to break. It started slowly in 2005. Commodity prices wobbled, then fuel prices spiked. The farmers who had followed Richard Vance's advice, the ones who had bought the $150,000 tractors and the massive plots of land on floating interest rates, suddenly couldn't make the math work. They couldn't service their debt. First National Bank began to foreclose. Richard Vance sat in his office and signed the papers that stripped families of land they had held for 3 generations. He didn't lose sleep over it. To Vance, it was just business. The bank would seize the distressed land, bundle it, and flip it to commercial developers for a massive profit. But Vance had a problem. The bank was severely over-leveraged. He had bet the bank's entire capital reserve on agricultural real estate continuing to rise. When the market started to correct, First National was left holding dozens of farms that were suddenly worth half of what the bank had loaned out against them. Federal regulators started visiting Oak Haven. They arrived in dark sedans, carrying thick briefcases, walking past Richard Vance's secretary with grim expressions. At the same time, the foreclosed farms began to hit the county auction block. Elias Thorne was there.
He stood in the back row, wearing his same canvas coat and battered boots. When Richard Vance's bank put up a 200-acre foreclosed parcel, expecting a bidding war from corporate buyers, the room was dead silent. Nobody had any credit left to bid. The bank needed cash desperately to satisfy the federal regulators. The auctioneer asked for $2,000 an acre. Silence. He asked for $1,500. Silence. Elias raised his hand. $800 an acre, he said quietly. The bank representative scowled, but they had no choice. They had to liquidate. Sold to the gentleman in the back row, the auctioneer called out. When it came time to settle up, Elias didn't ask for financing. He handed the clerk a cashier's check from Cottonwood Holdings, LLC, paid in full. He did it again 3 months later, buying a 300-acre farm for cash. He did it again 6 months after that, securing another 400 acres of prime bottomland. Elias was using the bank's own panic against them. He was buying up the very land Richard Vance had stolen from his neighbors, and he was doing it for pennies on the dollar, using the cash he had saved by refusing to participate in Vance's debt machine. By 2007, Elias Thorne, the man who had been told to sell his measly 40 acres, quietly owned 1,200 acres surrounding the town of Oak Haven, and he didn't owe a single red cent to anyone on earth. But Elias wasn't done. He didn't just want land. He remembered the look on Richard Vance's face when he had put his hand on Elias's shoulder and called him an old man. Elias wanted to make sure that Richard Vance and men exactly like him could never lock the doors on a working man in Oak Haven ever again. Elias began looking at the commercial real estate right in the center of town, specifically the parcels of land directly surrounding the First National Bank building. By the winter of 2007, Richard Vance was the undisputed king of Oak Haven's financial district. He wore custom-tailored suits, drove a German luxury sedan, and operated from a corner office on the 3rd floor of the First National Bank building, a historic, stone-pillared fortress sitting right in the center of the town square. But kings who only look at ledgers rarely notice what is happening on the ground. Elias Thorne, now 83 years old, still drove his rusted 1962 Ford F-100. He still wore canvas work pants and boots he repaired himself. To the casual observer, Elias was just a stubborn old relic who had somehow managed to hold on to a few acres of dirt. But through his quietly registered shell company, Cottonwood Holdings, LLC, Elias had been very busy in downtown Oak Haven. Elias didn't try to fight the bank in court.
He didn't wave protest signs. He used the very system Richard Vance worshipped to build a cage around him. It started with the old abandoned feed store directly across the alley from the bank's rear entrance. The bank used that alley for their armored cash deliveries and executive parking. When the feed store went up for tax auction, Cottonwood Holdings bought it for $22,000 cash. A month later, the vacant diner on the north side of the bank went up for sale. Cottonwood Holdings bought it. 6 months after that, the gravel lot that the bank leased for customer parking, a lease they had neglected to secure long-term because they arrogantly assumed the owner would never sell, was quietly purchased by Cottonwood Holdings. Elias was paying cash, using the massive, untaxed profits he had generated by growing high-yield crops without spending a single dime on the chemical inputs and leveraged equipment that Vance had pushed on the rest of the county. By the spring of 2008, Cottonwood Holdings owned every single property touching the First National Bank building. They owned the parking lot, they owned the delivery alley easements, they owned the airspace rights next door. Elias had effectively placed a geographic stranglehold around Richard Vance, and Vance didn't even know the name of the man holding the leash.
Then September 2008 arrived, and the illusion of modern, leveraged wealth shattered. The financial crisis didn't just hit Wall Street, it tore through rural agricultural banks like a tornado through a tin roof. First National Bank was holding millions of dollars in toxic commercial real estate loans and over-leveraged farm mortgages. The value of the land they had seized from bankrupt farmers plummeted overnight. Suddenly, the bank's books were bleeding out. Federal regulators descended on Oak Haven. They arrived in dark sedans, carrying thick briefcases, walking past Richard Vance's secretary with grim, unsmiling faces. They audited the bank's ledgers and delivered an ultimatum that sent a cold sweat down Vance's spine. First National Bank was critically undercapitalized. Vance had exactly 30 days to raise $3.5 million in liquid capital, or the FDIC would seize the bank, lock the doors, and liquidate its assets. Vance would be left with nothing but a ruined reputation and a worthless college ring. Panic set in. Vance tried to sell off the bank's portfolio of foreclosed farms, but nobody had any credit to buy them. He tried to secure emergency loans from larger banks in Chicago, but their lines of credit were frozen solid. His last desperate move was to leverage the bank's most valuable remaining asset, the historic First National Bank building itself. He found a commercial developer out of St. Louis willing to buy the building and lease it back to the bank, injecting exactly the cash Vance needed to satisfy the federal regulators. But when the developer's surveyors came down to inspect the site, the deal instantly fell apart. "Richard, we can't buy this building," the developer told him over the phone, sounding baffled. "You don't own the parking lot. You don't own the delivery alley. The easements you've been using belong to a private LLC, and they just filed notice that they are terminating your access rights next month. Your bank is completely landlocked. The property is commercially worthless to us." Vance was stunned. "Who owns it?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Who holds the easements?" "A company called Cottonwood Holdings," the developer replied, "and they aren't answering our calls." With only 7 days left before the federal regulators seized the bank, Richard Vance was a broken man. The pressed shirts looked baggy on him. The arrogant smile was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, desperate look of a man who realizes his entire life has been built on a foundation of paper and air. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 15 years to the week since Vance had told a 68-year-old farmer to sell his 40 acres, a courier arrived at First National Bank. He handed a thick manila envelope to Vance's secretary. Inside was a formal, legally binding offer from Cottonwood Holdings, LLC. The offer was brilliant, ruthless, and perfectly calibrated. Cottonwood Holdings offered to purchase the First National Bank building, all of its surrounding land, and the entirety of its distressed agricultural loan portfolio. The purchase price was exactly $3.5 million in cash. It was the exact amount Vance needed to keep the bank open and satisfy the federal regulators. But the terms were absolute. First National Bank would no longer own its building. They would become tenants of Cottonwood Holdings. The agricultural loan portfolio would be transferred entirely to Cottonwood's control, and the deal had to be signed within 48 hours. Vance had no choice. He didn't have the leverage, he didn't have the time, and he didn't have a backup plan.
He told his lawyers to draft the acceptance papers. He still had no idea who was behind Cottonwood Holdings. He assumed it was a ruthless corporate raider from New York or Chicago, someone who played the game even colder than he did. He was about to find out how wrong he was.
The closing took place on a Thursday morning in the polished mahogany boardroom on the third floor of the First National Building. Richard Vance sat at the head of the table, flanked by two anxious bank lawyers. His hands shook slightly as he uncapped his expensive fountain pen. The room was deathly quiet. He signed page after page, legally transferring the title of his fortress, the parking lots, and the deeds to dozens of local farms over to Cottonwood Holdings. He was signing away his empire to save himself from federal prosecution. Only when the final document was notarized and the $3.5 million wire transfer was confirmed by the escrow agent did the heavy oak door to the boardroom open. Richard Vance looked up, expecting to see a team of corporate lawyers in sharp suits. Instead, an 83-year-old man walked into the room. Elias Thorne wore canvas work pants, a faded chambray shirt, and boots that carried the faint, undeniable dust of Oak Haven bottomland. He walked slowly, unhurried, with the steady, grounded balance of a man who had spent his entire life trusting the dirt beneath his feet. He walked to the mahogany table, pulled out the chair directly across from Richard Vance, and sat down. He placed a heavy, grease-stained pair of leather work gloves on the polished wood. The blood drained from Richard Vance's face. He stopped breathing. The recognition hit him like a physical blow to the chest. "Hello, Richard," Elias said quietly. His voice held no anger, no gloating. It was simply the voice of a man stating a fact. "Remember me?" Vance opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at the paperwork in front of him. He looked at the signature line for Cottonwood Holdings, LLC. He looked back at the old man. "You," Vance whispered, the word barely escaping his throat. "It's you." Elias leaned forward, resting his calloused hands on the table. 15 years ago, I sat in your office, Elias said, the silence in the boardroom making every word ring like a bell. I asked for a 90-day extension to get my crops out of the ground. You put your hand on my shoulder. You laughed at my equipment. You told me I was too old, and you told me to sell my 40 acres. Vance's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing this wasn't a standard corporate buyout. This was a 15-year execution of pure, unadulterated justice. I didn't sell the 40 acres, Richard, Elias said, his voice steady. I went home and listened to the soil. I stopped buying your bank's debt. I stopped buying your system's chemicals. I saved my cash. And while you were leveraging this town into bankruptcy, I was buying back the farms you stole from my neighbors. Elias reached across the table and picked up the deed to the First National Bank building. He folded it carefully, exactly the way he had folded his $4,000 loan receipt 15 years earlier, and placed it in his chambray shirt pocket. You told me to sell my farm, Elias said, looking directly into Vance's terrified eyes. I decided to buy your bank instead. Welcome to being a tenant, Richard. You'll find the rent is due on the 1st of the month. Don't be late. Elias Thorne stood up, picked up his work gloves, and walked out of the boardroom. He didn't look back. Richard Vance resigned as bank president 3 weeks later. He left Oak Haven quietly, moving to a suburb outside of Kansas City to sell insurance. The man who had mocked the old ways was chased out of town by a man who had never abandoned them. But Elias Thorne didn't buy the bank's portfolio just for revenge. He bought it for redemption. Over the next 5 years, Cottonwood Holdings restructured every single agricultural loan the bank had held. He stripped away the predatory floating interest rates.
He offered debt forgiveness programs to young farmers who were willing to transition away from heavy chemical inputs and return to sustainable, low-cost farming practices, the very practices that had made Elias wealthy. He leased the foreclosed farms back to the families who had lost them, setting the rent at a fraction of the cost, payable only after a successful harvest. If the crop failed, they owed nothing. He taught them what his father had taught him: never owe more than you can pay off in one bad year. By 2015, Oak Haven was thriving. It became an oasis of independent, debt-free family farms in a world increasingly dominated by corporate agriculture. And Elias? Elias Thorne lived to be 96 years old. He never moved into a mansion. He never bought a new truck. He lived in the same farmhouse, walked the same 40 acres, and every spring he still went out to the equipment shed, pulled back the canvas tarp, and started up his 1953 Farmall Super M. It still ran perfectly, because some things, like good iron, true patience, and a man's word, never become obsolete. They just wait for the rest of the world to remember why they were built in the first place. When Elias passed away, he didn't leave behind a corporate empire. He left behind a community of free men and women who owned the dirt they stood on, completely untouched by the banks that had once tried to harvest them. So let me leave you with this. Right now, somewhere, somebody is being told they are too old, too poor, or too far behind to make a difference. Someone is being laughed at by an expert in a pressed suit who thinks a piece of paper on their wall makes them smarter than a lifetime of dirt on your hands. Someone is being told to give up what they own and let the system take over. The loan officer told a 68-year-old farmer to sell his 40 acres and give up. 15 years later, that same farmer owned 1,200 acres, owned the bank's building, and forced the man who laughed at him out of town. He didn't do it with an app, he didn't do it with a computer, and he didn't do it with a loan. He did it with cash, patience, and a deep, unbreakable trust in the soil. If this story changed how you think about patience, debt, and the ultimate power of proving the arrogant wrong, I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that subscribe button for more forgotten stories of American agriculture and the underdogs who beat the system. Second, drop a comment down below and tell me, what is the best piece of old-school wisdom a parent or grandparent ever passed down to you? Did it save you when the modern world failed? And finally, if you want to support this channel and help me dig up more of these incredible true stories, the Super Thanks button is right below. Every bit helps keep this history alive. The banker said, "Sell the farm, old man." The old man bought the bank. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.